Welcome, everyone. I'm Shanni Prutchi, security consultant and penetration tester at Bishop Fox. Thank you for joining us today for our live stream, OWASP ASVS, Unlocking Application Security. Before we get started, I'll give you a quick introduction about myself. I've been at Bishop Fox for nearly 3 years, and I primarily focus on application security, threat modeling, and architecture security assessments. I enjoy presenting at security conferences, and I've shared a variation of this presentation a few times this year, including at OWASP 2023 Global AppSec in Washington, D.C., and at OWASP AppSec Israel. Additionally, I sit on the ASVS working group that supports the primary authors of the ASVS. We're excited to have you with us today for this deep dive into the OWASP ASVS and my analysis of the 278 verification requirements. I'll teach you how to generate test cases and gain insights to effectively test your own applications against the standard. And most importantly, we'll have time for Q&A towards the end, so I look forward to hearing from you via our social channels. I'll also be available to chat and answer questions directly following this live stream in the Hackers Lounge on the Bishop Fox RedSec Discord server. Let's get started. So this webinar goes into detail into the specific requirements listed in the ASVS. We recommend downloading the Bishop Fox ASVS technical guide if you're interested in following along. This will download a zip file with the technical guide PDF and a spreadsheet. The PDF contains some analysis that I've spoken about in a variation on this presentation, but we're going to be focusing on the contents of the spreadsheet. The first things first, I want to offer a brief review of what the ASVS is for those who may not be super familiar. But for those of you who are, this is just two slides, so we're not going to be taking up too much time. First off, what is the ASVS? ASVS is short for the Application Security Verification Standard. It's an open standard that was released by OWASP first in 2008. We're current in the 4th iteration, with the 5th iteration available as bleeding edge. However, for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to be talking about version 4. Like I mentioned, this is an open source standard, and it lists 278 controls over 14 verification topics. So those verification topics are architecture, design, and threat modeling, authentication, session management, access control, validation, sanitization and encoding, stored cryptography, error handling and logging, data protection, communication, malicious code, business logic, files and resources, API and web services, and configuration. The controls are each associated with one of 3 assurance levels, and that assurance levels speak to the security needs of the target application. So level 1 is our lowest assurance level, and it reflects the bare minimum for all applications. Basically, any application, it doesn't matter how simple it is, needs to meet these controls. Most importantly, this level of assurance can be completely verified with penetration testing. Almost completely verified because there are 20 verification requirements that can't be addressed with penetration testing, and we'll discuss those a little bit later. Level 2 is what is appropriate for most applications. So any applications where you need to authenticate or something like that are appropriate for level 2. Finally, we have level 3, which is the strictest, and that applies to critical applications such as those supporting medical uses, defense, or critical infrastructure. The ASVS serves 2 primary purposes: for secure application development and to align vendor offerings, but it also offers a few other uses. Those include secure development training resources, secure coding checklists, guidance on architecturing secure applications, as well as purchasing secure software. But there's also a use case that is not explicitly mentioned in the standard, but is valid, and that is as a testing framework. And this is the context that we're going to be exploring today. There's a rising use case for the ASVS as a testing framework, and it could be attributed to the need for organizations to need to test against something, but that's not a regulatory compliance standard. And so, as a consulting firm, we see a lot of organizations ask us to test against the OWASP top 10, which is very vague, as some of those things can't really be tested against in a penetration testing sense or even in a code review sense. Now we see clients starting to ask to test against the ASVS, which is a great a great starting point, because the ASVS is pretty prescriptive about what you need to have. We also see it being used directly in the industry. So the App Defense Alliance, which is a program started by Google in order to assess the security of applications in the Google Play Store and is now part of the Linux Foundation, is based on the ASVS. So the App Defense Alliance has CASA and MASA. CASA is the Cloud App Security Assessment, and MASA is the Mobile App Security Assessment. They both of these draw their requirements from the ASVS and the Mobile ASVS, or the MASVS. Additionally, CREST offers the OWASP verification standard, which is an accreditation for app security testing companies to show that they are able to test against levels 1 and 2 of the ASVS. So one of these standards is to show that your organization has the knowledge to test against the ASVS, while the other one says that your application has been verified against the ASVS. So this testing is now available and is growing more in availability. So what does this actually involve? Only some of the requirements can be verified with penetration testing, and those are level 1. The standard says that verifying the other requirements calls for access to documentation, source code, configuration, and the people involved in the development process. But apart from that, there isn't much other guidance. And so, given the lack of guidance, it can be difficult to figure out what you actually need in order to verify those requirements. And the guide that we're discussing today, and that you hopefully have open right now, was created to provide that very guidance that we found lacking. So in most cases, you can get away with white box or hybrid testing, which is penetration testing with the availability of source code, as well as documentation and developer attestation. However, there are situations where stricter testing is needed. For example, CASA Assurance Tier Level 3 explicitly states that the assessment not only has to test the application, but also the application's supporting infrastructure and data storage. This is what we would call true validation, because developer claims and documentation can't be trusted to be accurate. You see, screenshots can be faked, and the developers in the documentation may not even be intentionally or maliciously not accurate. It could be that the implementation was changed last minute to support some legacy issue, or that the documentation wasn't reflected to update any changes. In cases like this, we can add one more type of evidence, and that's infrastructure access. For the rest of this section, we're going to explore each of these 4 types of evidence. First and foremost is penetration testing. This covers 146 verification requirements. 127 of them are in level 1, which is all level 1 requirements, with the exception of 20, 16 in level 2, and 3 in level 3. The ASVS does advise against using solely penetration testing for verifying the penetration testable requirements, because with any time box testing, you are going to miss some findings. So some examples of requirements that call for penetration testing, and this is when the spreadsheets will become handy. We have requirements 2.3, 2.3.1, and 2.3.2 in the authentication lifecycle section of the authentication chapter. And you can see that 2.3.1 is a level 1 requirement. So you can see in the spreadsheet that it applies to levels 1, 2, and 3. And traditionally, if it applies to level 1, it's also going to apply to levels 2 and 3, because we're increasing in rigor. Meanwhile, level 2.3.2 is level 2. So both of these can be verified with pen testing, but that need is represented differently. Level 1 is by definition penetration testable. And you can see that in the evidence type. We say level 1 verifiable with pen test. Because levels 2 and 3 are not penetration testable by definition, we say that they can be verified with penetration testing, but the penetration testing covering level 1 won't address it. And we say it's where applicable because this is only in cases where you have enrollment uh, and use of user provided authentication devices. And so this may not be applicable in all cases. Our next type of evidence is source code. Here, there is recommendation to do some automated and manual review, where automated review would be like a SaaS tool. You're not expected to do everything through manual review. By itself, this evidence type covers 71 requirements, but you do have some requirements where that type of evidence needs to be combined with some other evidence type, such as documentation or infrastructure. So this is what we call, a combination. And we will see that across other evidence types as well. So here's an example of 2 of the level 1 requirements that can't be verified with penetration testing. So we see in the level 1 column, it says L1 required, not testable. However, if we look at the requirements, what it is, the content of the requirements, it's saying that we need to be able to store the password securely, that they're resistant to offline attacks, and that it needs to be hashed and salted. These are security controls that need to be included in applications, which is the definition of L1, but it's something that you can't really test with pen testing, which is why it is L1 required but not testable. Our third type of evidence is documentation. We have 11 verification requirements that call for the loan and 12 other requirements that call for it in combination with either infrastructure or source code. The 11 verification requirements that only need documentation are all in the architecture, design, and threat modeling chapter. And when we talk about documentation, we're including discussion of policies and processes, application design documents, such as functional security requirements, interviews with developers, software bills of material, and other sort of documentations associated not just with the development of the application, but also with the security maturity of the organization itself. So I mentioned that all of the requirements that call for straight documentation are contained in the architecture, design, and threat modeling chapter. Here are just a few verification requirements where documentation is called for, and one where documentation is used alongside source code. So you can see that there's this access necessary column that, at least for documentation, defines what documentation is actually needed. When we talk about infrastructure, that access necessary column is going to talk about the type of infrastructure that's needed to verify the requirement. As you can see, for 3 of these cases, you only need documentation. But there are cases where documentation alone is not sufficient. So you can see in requirement 1.1.6, which covers the use of reusable security controls, it needs more than just documentation, but it actually needs to confirm that the controls are actually implemented, and you would do that with source code. There's also a requirement for documentation not within the organization, but documentation that's generated by the organization's credential service provider, as they would be the ones who determine certain policies. So a credential service provider is a trusted entity that issues security tokens or electronic credentials. As you can see, this is only a level 3 requirement, and that's because a credential service provider is only going to be used by high criticality applications that are going to call for level 3. Our final evidence type is infrastructure, which is solely called for by 23 verification requirements and used in conjunction with another evidence type for 13 requirements. And when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about the application supporting infrastructure, such as the server running the application, logging systems, and so on. And we'll go into further detail in what this means in the next section. Now, for internal verification purposes, where I'm doing something like an internal check, getting a screenshot of the relevant information might be enough. But screenshots, like I said earlier, can be faked. So stricter tests might require direct access to the infrastructure's interface. Now, for some type of infrastructure, this is not super difficult. For example, AWS has special account types which can be granted to security testers, which lets you only read some of the configuration information, but doesn't let you read or edit contents of databases, for example. But other infrastructure access may be more complex. And this does become a concern, especially if you're using an external firm or just have a large organization, because as you increase availability to systems, you are increasing the attack surface. So now is when we get to the complicated part, which is where you need access to what. As we mentioned earlier, infrastructure can refer to the application supporting infrastructure. So as a result, we'll need access to things like source code control systems, logging solutions, key management systems, server configurations, permissions, all sorts of things. And this is just a list of every single piece of access that is mentioned in the ASVS reference guide. So for the next few slides, we're going to go through different types of this infrastructure evidence and what verification requirements call for them and what this actually means. So in our work, we found that 17% of infrastructure-based requirements are related to database configuration. In some cases, like in 2.8.2 and 2.10.3, database configuration details are needed in addition to source code to check that the appropriate keys or credentials are used in the code, but also that the database where they're stored is secure. Meanwhile, for other requirements, it is a bit more straightforward. We also have CI/CD, which refers to the organization's code, build, test, and deployment pipeline, and that also comprises 17% of the infrastructure-based requirements. You can see that in 1.14.2 and 1.14.3, which is the threat modeling, the configuration architecture section of the architecture, design, and threat modeling chapter, we see references to two parts of the CI/CD pipeline: test and deploy. We need a source code analysis tool has to be built into the test process to ensure that vulnerable or outdated dependencies are not used by the application. And we need to know that the software development process ensures the integrity of remote deployments. Another type is a key management system, and that's addressed in 9% of the requirements. When we talk about a key management system, we're talking about technologies such as Azure Key Vault, AWS KMS, Google Cloud KMS, or HashiCorp Vault. Really, we only see that the ASVS is concerned as far as cryptographic keys being used to encrypt the entire database, as well as for application components. So not a huge amount of coverage, but it is notable. An important part that we also have of application security is logging so that incidents can be detected and analyzed. Addressed by the requirements ensuring that logs are in all the same format so they can be ingested by a SIEM, that the logs are detailed enough to be helpful when investigating an incident, and that the time sources are synced. And from experience, this is really important because not having the time of your logs synced can cause a huge headache when you're doing incident response activities. Logging makes up 14% of these infrastructure-based requirements, so it's obviously important. In addition to prescribing the content and format of the logs, ASVS also defines what activities need to be logged. So you obviously want authentication and access decisions, including the failed ones, to be logged. And you also need to be careful not to include credentials or session tokens, because in the case where the logs are compromised, you don't want credentials to be compromised as part of that. And as an extension, we want to make sure that those logs can't be modified so that later, if you're doing incident response, you now no longer have accurate logs. The next three categories that we're going to review don't hold significant pieces of the infrastructure-based pie, but are worth discussing because it can get a little bit unclear with what you're actually looking for. So the configuration architecture section of the architecture, design, and threat modeling chapter, which is the first chapter, ensures that both application components, as well as the entire application, is appropriately segregated at the network level. And the purpose is to ensure that an attacker that gains access to one component can't spread. So really you're preventing elevation of privilege. And this is validated through checking firewall rules, VLAN setup, and other control points. Some other requirements look at how pieces are configured, like the application cache servers, application proxies, and the service mesh. For example, if an application is running in Kubernetes, such as defined in 9.2.3, you're going to call for the environment's YAML files to validate those settings. The final infrastructure access that's worth mentioning is credentials. From reading the requirement that we have on the screen, 2.10.2, it might seem like you need to access the clear text credentials to confirm that the default credentials aren't used. Instead, you can compare a list of the credential hashes to a list of known bad credential hashes so as not to compromise the credentials' confidentiality, because there's really no reason for you to be reading a list of everyone's passwords. We do have some requirements in the ASVS that I personally struggled with understanding, whether it was knowing where they were applied or the language was very vague. And this guidance is offered in the notes column of the spreadsheet, but I also want to discuss them here so that any questions can be asked towards the end. So our first is requirement 1.5.3, which is in the architecture, design, and threat modeling chapter in the input and output architecture section. So this case isn't so much confusing, but more of a case where controls may not be applied correctly. So an organization may believe that having a web application firewall or a WAF is enough to protect their application from the input-based attacks that are warned against in this requirement, like cross-site scripting or SQL injection. Any penetration tester would laugh at this because WAFs can be bypassed with just a little bit of work. And while WAFs do have a role to play, input validation needs to be implemented within the application itself and not just with a tool that's tacked on. Another requirement is 2.10.1, which is in the service authentication chapter section of the authentication chapter. There is a little bit of confusion in the AppSec community surrounding this requirement, specifically because the language is vague. Now, this is fair because each requirement needs to be sufficiently generalized to apply to every sort of technology that you might see in an application. Like I said, the ASVS is an open standard. So there's lots of discussion that goes into in the GitHub issues that is open to everyone in the community. And some commenters in the GitHub issues have proposed getting rid of this requirement for version 5, but there seems to be more favor to replace it with a requirement that calls for some form of authentication that's unique, rotatable, and non-default. And that it was what we're most likely going to be seeing in version 5 of the standard when it's solidified. Another is requirement 3.5.2, which is in the token-based session management section of the session management chapter. At a surface read, this can be a little bit concerning since we frequently see API keys being used for component-to-component communication. However, this actually specifically refers to sessions since we're in the session management chapter. And we know that static tokens are a bad idea for session management because if a secret is stolen, that session will be good forever and is easily hijacked. So it makes sense that this is specifically referring to session to session and not component to component communication. Our final requirement that calls for a little bit of clarification is in the access control chapter under the other access control consideration section. And this talks about admin interfaces. Now, there was actually some debate internally at Bishop Fox if this talked about admin interfaces for supporting infrastructure like an AWS dashboard or an admin interface for an application. This specifically refers to the target application super user interface, which may just not exist. So if you're in a multi-tenant situation, this would be like that vendor's client support account that can access and create new tenants. That's really what we're concerned about, not so much about the admin interfaces for the supporting infrastructure, but that should have, appropriate controls as well. It's just not covered by the ASVS. As we mentioned in the PDF guide, this work references version 4.0.3, which is the latest stable version of the ASVS as of November 2023, which is this month, and was released October 2021, so just about 2 years ago. In the analysis that we featured in the PDF download of the guide, there were 5 requirements that were excluded as they're either being deleted or combined with other requirements. However, the spreadsheet still offers the guidance on how they can be verified, so I want to make sure that we cover that. So we have 3 requirements in the general data protection section of the data protection chapter. 8.1.2, which discusses data caches, is planned to be merged with 8.1.1, which also refers to caching, as these two were determined to be duplicates. Meanwhile, 8.1.5 and 8.1.6 are being completely removed, as the target application is never actually involved in any part or any step of the backup process. Like, while the application probably gets backed up, because the application is not involved in that process, it was determined that it's not appropriate for inclusion in the ASVS. There's another requirement, 8.3.4, that was determined to be a duplicate, this time of 1.8.1, which reads that verify that all sensitive data is identified and classified into protection levels. The suggested wording post-merge is verify that all sensitive data created and processed by the application has been identified and classified into protection levels, and ensure that a policy is in place on how to deal with sensitive data. Finally, 8.3.6 is being deleted because it's not practical in a lot of use cases. We also have requirement 14.2.6. It's not being deleted or merged, but instead it's actually changing levels. This is in the dependency section of the configuration chapter. Right now, this is an L2 and L3 requirement, and it's being changed to only apply to L3, such that only risky libraries or those with historical vulnerabilities need to be sandboxed away from sensitive systems. This was actually brought up by Iman Sharaf, who is a member of the OWASP community and now sits alongside me on the ASVS board. He realized that because NPM packages are intentionally not sandboxed, Node.js applications would inherently not comply with this requirement. So this is a great example where feedback from the community has a huge impact on the standard as a whole. So obviously the ASVS covers quite a lot and it can be complex. I've read it cover to cover several times. It's really, really great, thrilling read. And, I don't even have it down. So, it is totally normal to need clarification. And the downside is I can't promise that I'll know the answer. I can offer my insight. And in the worst case, I can pass you on to the rest of the community and to the authors of the ASVS, who are absolutely wonderful and offered a lot of assistance in this process. Are there any questions that you guys have? Please put them in our social channels and I can answer them now, and they'll be passed on to me because I don't have my eye on the social channels as is. I will say that we're very excited to be able to get the 5th iteration of the ASVS out for general use. I mentioned it's right now bleeding edge, so anyone who wants to use the ASVS as any standard and map it to anything, it is recommended that you still use version 4.0.3 since that is the current stable version. We don't have any answers quite so far on when version 5 is going to be out on a stable level. but we hope that that will be soon within the next year. Thank you so much for joining us today. To learn more about this topic and other Bishop Fox resources, check out our blog posts and tools page on bishopfox.com. We would love to know what you thought about this technical training, and let us know in the chat what you thought. And if you have any remaining questions or just want to hang out, join me in the Hackers Lounge on the Bishop Fox RedSec Discord server. Otherwise, we hope to see you next time, and have a great rest of your day.